You might be sitting alone at a sewing machine, or you might be sitting alone in a rare book library doing your research, or you might be sitting alone behind a computer writing a policy. But there's a person on the other side of what you're making, whether that's the spreadsheet or the policy or the quilt, right? And that's kind of the bonding that I've always found so rewarding, that it's not just me in a silo. It really has to be me out in the world.
What fuels a multi-passionate life? I'm Jessica Wan, and in this podcast, I interview people who straddle two completely different worlds. I call them Ampersands, and we are collectively designing the Ampersand Manifesto. I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Simran Thadani, rare book expert, people and culture leader, and textile artist. Sim earned her PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania and has researched and lectured in libraries across the US and Europe. In her work as a people ops leader, she's advised leaders and designed initiatives across the employee lifecycle, including recruiting, onboarding, and engagement. Sim also works as a quilter and crocheter and is known for her eye for color. Sim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. It's awesome to be here.
I watched one of your talks on rare books, where you proudly claimed the title of book nerd as a kid who was fascinated with reading and learning. What drove you to become a rare book expert and really go the distance in this field?
I realized recently that a lot of the things I cared about very young. When I was a kid, I said to my mom that I wanted to be a librarian because it meant that I could just read all day. And I think mentally her response was, okay, yeah, sure. That's how the world works. But outwardly, she encouraged me to keep reading. I majored in English, which was not a very viable or lucrative thing for an 18-year-old to be thinking about doing, especially coming as the child of immigrants to another country. I was the child of immigrants myself, and then moving halfway across the world to go to college, but saying I want to study the humanities. I'm sure my parents were a little puzzled, but they were are my biggest supporters. I was a reader through and through. And then one day in grad school, it hit me like a ton of bricks due to the work of a couple of professors that I encountered early on, that books were not just text. They were also containers of text and carriers of meaning and had messages from the past. One of my mentors likes to say that books are alive with the marks of their makers. And that really started to ring true when I realized it's not just the text of Dante's Inferno, or it's not just the text of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or Shakespeare's plays. There is a whole history behind this object that you're holding in your hand. And even if that is a new Penguin edition that you bought last year, there's also a previous printing and production history. And what did the author actually mean? And is this text that you're holding in your hand really the text that the author wrote with his pen or her pen long, long ago? And I moved from being a reader of letters and words and paragraphs and sentences to being a reader of books as objects. And that's where the pivot came from being an English major to a librarian, truly, because I realized that I could have a career as a custodian of these objects that often get hidden behind glass cases or in closed doors. There's libraries have hours and they have to be air conditioned and humidity controlled to protect the books, but that there was a real opportunity here to share this magic of the object with other people, and not just the object of the new modern edition of blah, 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 but the first edition or the second edition or the third edition of blah, blah, blah. And I had a very, very delightful time exploring, but then also sharing, learning, and teaching with other people in the field and beyond, with everybody from undergrads to senior professors and the general public, the joy of books as objects.
Sounds like there's so much history and there's so much humanity in how books came to be. You are a frequent public speaker for programs like Creative Mornings Global, where you give a talk entitled The Magic of Books. In this day and age, books compete with all that technology has given us. How would you describe the role printed books play in a digital-first world?
I think about this every day as I read my son his bedtime stories, or as we have quiet family reading time where each of us is with a physical book. and he can't read yet, but he is whispering to himself or telling himself stories and so on. I see a certain sense of delight naturally, but also a certain sense of insolent protest and resistance in sticking to the physical object when it is so much lighter and easier, and when the pixels have so many more colors, and it's so much more delightful for a child to say, Mama, can I watch this on TV instead? Or, can you just turn on the iPad for me? Or things like that. There's a sense of resistance in getting out of pixel land and really having a more tactile experience. We recently received as a gift a very, very 3D ABC book that was published by Chronicle Books, which is known for their fabulous book design, especially for children. And we have another ABC book where you press a button and the book sings itself to you. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we all know this. Would I want that to be mediated by a screen, which sort of sends one into this passive, receptive, non-interactive state where the screen is kind of doing all the work for you? I think it'll happen inevitably. But as long as I can, I want to try and stave it off. And I still give him the occasional Daniel Tiger episode to watch. And that's also a story. And it teaches him a lot of things, like when he has to go potty, he needs to go right away. There's good material in Daniel Tiger and Peppa Pig and Bluey and so on. And yet I feel drawn because of my joy and delight and magic that I've gained and experienced. I feel a sense of resistance, even living in Silicon Valley, even in the middle of tech world, to the idea that screens are just as good or just as effective, because I see how he interacts with those 3D books or those singing books and has to actually make an effort to get to know them. And I think this is the work that I want to be doing for him, not the work of sitting him down to receive only, to consume only, but rather to interact and engage.
I love this idea of books as resistance and books really engaging so many more of your senses. You served as the founding executive director of Letterform Archive, a nonprofit center in San Francisco that offers access to historical items related to lettering, typography, and graphic design. And under your leadership, the center was able to grow more quickly than predicted. What were some of your learnings from that role?
One of the main things that I took away from that role in 18 months from a career perspective was that I was very happy and excited to do the back end and systems and foundational work, like negotiating a lease, or like navigating a contract process, or like registering with the state, or running a spreadsheet, or doing payroll, or managing a performance review process, so that the people who were interacting with the customer, the user, the reader, the visitor, the guest, could do their job better. And that's how I actually turned to people and culture work after I left Letterform Archive, because I realized that although there was a joy in books and that direct encounter and the librarianship work, the stewardship, the custodianship, the interaction with the patron, etc., that I also found a particular joy in running the organization and helping to build it behind the scenes. So in a way, funnily, Letterform took me away from the frontlines work of books. But the other thing that I realized, and this was the period during which I gave that Creative Mornings talk, which was featured in the Creative Mornings global newsletter, Books as Magic, that I loved working in a place with such physical beauty surrounding me, and the chance to get up and take a stretch break, go to the bathroom, come out and say, oh, I think I'll just browse in the stacks for 10 minutes. The luck, the privilege of being surrounded by, at that time, I think we were 40,000 objects. The collection is now 100,000, so it's grown 2.5 times even since I left. You never knew what you were going to find. And when a visitor came in saying they wanted to look at the work of Pete Zwart, or they wanted to look at calligraphy, or they wanted to look at our Bibles, or they wanted to look at, some graphic design posters, you had the opportunity to sneak them something they were not expecting, like a psychedelic Fillmore poster from a concert that was in San Francisco back in the 60s or 70s. Or they wanted to see the Bible, but you could say, oh, look, compare and contrast this Bible from the 1500s, which is written out by hand with ink on parchment, with this other Bible that was printed by Eric Gill in the 1920s. And the joy, the most commonly heard word in that reading room was wow. The delight, the unexpected surprise, again, the serendipity. And I know I sound romantic, and yet I think this is the kind of thing that's disappearing in a world that's more polarized, more introverted, more lonely, more in crisis. There's room for joy. There's room for inspiration. There's room for learning through the matching up of unexpected things. And even if I went down my rabbit hole on my bathroom breaks, right, or came out of the meeting and I said, "Oh, let me just take a break and I'll look at this," and our founder, curator, or my librarian colleagues would come around and say, "Oh, look what we just got in the mail." Every day was like Christmas. We would open up these boxes from auction houses or from rare book dealers, or even very ordinary things that were not expensive. It didn't all have to be sourced from an amazing place, but someone would come by and say, "Do you want my collection of graphic design manuals, or do you want my collection of calligraphy pens," or things like that? And then we started to hold workshops and so on. And there was this beautiful, virtuous cycle of learning and experiencing and contributing and sharing and teaching that just brought together people with this common passion. And you always learned the most, I think, from the things that you weren't expecting. So when you ask about what were some of my lessons from there, some were career lessons for me that I took away, and some were just open yourself up to this and see what comes. No 2 days at work are going to be alike at a startup, but no 2 days in a library are going to be alike, because you never know what book is going to lie around the corner.
Kind of being ready for surprise.
And possibility, absolutely.
After your tenure at Letterform, you grew the team at Springboard, an e-learning company, from 25 to 250 employees. Many employees that you hired have celebrated over 5 years there and now have thriving teams of their own. What do you find fulfilling about working in people ops and growing teams?
This has been one of the hugest surprises and delights of my life. My whole life, I thought, I'm a book nerd, or I'm a social person, but actually I'm also an introvert. I need to kind of go back into my shell and recharge by reading a book or by, taking a nap or whatever. But my whole life, I also believed that books and spreadsheets were easier to work with because they didn't argue back. They didn't need performance management. They didn't file complaints with HR, and not that I had done anything egregious, but it just felt so much easier to relate to inanimate objects, right? Books were endlessly open, if you know what I mean. Literally, you crack a spine and there it is, the wealth of knowledge and the information. And not just what you see is what you get, because I was also poking around in bindings and looking at the typography and the ink and the paper and all of that. So there were layers and layers of meaning there. And yet it was so much easier to interact with books than it was to interact with people, right? And I say this as a social person. I'm not a misanthrope. I'm not a sociopath. But from a work perspective, it felt like I was setting myself up for success by chasing footnotes or by chasing first editions or things like that. And when I started working at Springboard, I brought the work of hiring and building the right team from Letterform to scale. In that, Letterform was a 3-person team that I helped grow to 9 people. And Springboard began at 25 people and very rapidly grew to 250. And that joy, a different joy, right, of matching tab A to slot B, in terms of here's our job description, who's the best person we can find to do this job? How do we assess that skill set? Where do we look for them? And then how do we sell them on this opportunity of a lifetime, right? What we hope is going to be an amazing adventure for them, and also hugely beneficial to us as a business to bring on that, that right fit. And so I loved the thrill of the hunt, just as I had for books in libraries. But I also learned the nuances of reading people, in a sense, right? Looking for that value, looking for their values and seeing whether they were a match for ours, looking at what they could add in terms of their value and their values to our values. And we weren't very monolithic about it. There were things we cared deeply about at Springboard, and we tried to be very, very open to learning new things. And I realized that people, in a sense, were another kind of substrate, another kind of way to learn about the world and another way to interact. And sure, they talked back at you, and sometimes they were mad, and sometimes you were mad. And sometimes you realized you had hired the wrong person, and maybe you needed to have a difficult conversation about somebody not performing, or maybe it was time for them to leave, or they wanted to leave and you didn't want them to leave. It's more complicated. It's more nuanced. Of course, you're dealing with another human being. It's not an artifact. This is a relationship.
Let's pause here for a moment to think about this question. What do your work relationships look like right now? Outside of hosting this podcast, I partner with leaders in the workplace as they rise up. Perhaps you've gotten a promotion, landed a new role, or taken on a lot more responsibility, and you need a trusted sounding board to support you as you support your team. I coach individuals and leadership teams to rise to the challenge with my Ampersand blend of analytical and creative. If any of this intrigues you, reach out to me at jessicawan.com. Now, back to the show. Let's talk about this side of you as a textile artist. You mentioned that your mother owned a boutique that designed bespoke high-end clothing for hundreds of women over 15 years. When did the textile arts make an appearance in your life in a bigger way? And how did you know that this was important to you to nurture?
Through this podcast, I'm going to issue an apology to my mother because growing up in the 80s, I sort of rejected domesticity with the full permission of my parents, right? I was brought up, you're going to have a career, you're going to, do big things and my mom's sewing business or clothing business and the work she was doing was very much in home for women in their personal lives, things like that. And I was on this career path, which was reading and publishing and things like that. And I sort of ignored my mother's domestic invisible labor of sewing buttons on or mending clothes or, choosing the right fabrics for her customers, or women would come over for their third fitting during dinner time and they were going off to this big event. And, I think I saw it as something she did, but not something that I needed to be interested in. And of course, we all turn into our mothers at some point, right? So many years go by and a friend had just turned 60 and I noticed that many of the women at her 60th birthday party were quilters, knitters, crocheters. And it occurred to me that this was one of the ways that she, as a stay-at-home mom, had built community for herself. And that these were women who had been going on retreats or sharing patterns or scraps of fabric for 25 years. And I thought, gosh, there's a wealth of something here. And I think my mother must have had that with her customers and with her, her workers, but I just never tapped into that network or that weave, let's call it, right, of the community that she had built. And so I was very taken with this idea that, quilting could be something that I would take up and learn. And I was, I think, 35 at the time. And I said to my friend Barbara, who lived in Boston at the time, and I said, Barbara, I'm going to take a month out of my life and come learn to quilt with you. And she said, do you think you maybe want to take a class first? Because you might not even like it. But I'm that person who will jump in with both feet. And I sense in my gut, this is something I really want to try. And once I'm in it, then I want to know all the things about it. That was 5 years ago. And I think I've started to really get to that 10,000 hour mark because once I jumped in and took my first how to use a sewing machine class, I was immediately hooked and started to make quilts for all and sundry, have now graduated to quilted, non-quilt objects. So everything from Christmas stockings and tote bags to keychains and pillow covers. And I have become Little Miss Domestic in that way, right? I'm mending my son's clothes and putting buttons on my husband's shirts and not looking at it with those same eyes of, oh, this is over there and I'm over here, but thinking about this is that work where with each stitch, I'm being more mindful and present. This is the love that I'm sewing into this gift that I'm giving that I made with my own hands. And somebody could go to Walmart or Anthropologie or anywhere in between and buy themselves a nice quilt. And yet I hope that if I give them something, it will be used to death and valued and treasured in a way that no store-bought item would be. And I'm doing the same kind of bespoke work for other people the way that my mom did so many years ago, but this time with a whole new sense of respect and appreciation for the thoughtfulness and the real true design sense. Because as a quilter, you're making hundreds of design decisions with every finished object. And just recognizing it's a different kind of intelligence. It's a different kind of labor, but it is no less valuable than publishing a book, for example.
I'm seeing a lot of parallels between the way you talk about books and quilts and the kind of almost reverence around the object or the history and the love behind there. You recently taught a close friend's 7-year-old daughter to quilt and made her twin-size bed quilt. She participated in every step. What did that project mean to you?
One of the things that I have come back to over my entire life is that I have spent a lot of time thinking about connecting people and information. And that means not only as a librarian, helping people find the book that they wanted, or finding a friend a footnote to follow when they say, hey, can you tell me about this or that? Recently, a friend was teaching a seminar on old handwriting, and I connected her with a friend, a different friend who is a quill maker, who turns goose feathers into quills to practice early handwriting styles. And so I'm a connector in that sense, right? That I'm connecting people with other people who have the knowledge. My interest in communication and knowledge sharing also translates over to the fiber arts, where there's a thriving community of people who are sharing these things and making them from a cottage industry or a home craft into a real career and professional undertaking level of respect. And for me, coming to the actual answer to your question, this for me was a way to communicate with that 7-year-old and to connect her with knowledge or information that she was interested in, and for us to have a shared language. She is a little withdrawn sometimes in social situations. She's not super outgoing. Even though I've known her all her life, I didn't often feel like we had much to say to each other, right? Hey, how's it going? Did you have a good day at school? But for this, she really came out of her shell, and I set the rules for her. I said the first rule is you got to have fun. The second rule is if you're not having fun, you got to let me know. Not let your mom know, let me know. And that was the first time that I really felt like we had connected through this work that I was doing of connecting her with this knowledge that she was seeking. And this summer, I'm so excited to share that she's going to sewing camp because she loved it so much.
Oh, that's wonderful. What else ties together your work as an artist, a people leader, and a rare books expert?
I think one of the things that pained and frustrated me about academia is the notion of the ivory tower, not just collectively, that everybody's in this disconnected world talking about irrelevant ideas and so on. The stereotype, right, of the ivory tower is arcane research and things you study just for fun, but that won't help you in the real world and so on. But even individuals, I think, sometimes fall into their ivory tower because their research can sort of separate them from people in that they're so far down their rabbit hole that they're not really able to speak other people's language. And there are lots of very clear period divides. For example, do you study the Renaissance or do you study the 18th century? As if one fine day, the period just woke up and said, okay, now we're a new period. There are lots of, I think, sadly, walls in academia. And some of that is because there's less funding than there used to be, and there's more competition for jobs and, so on and so forth. But the beautiful thing about my graduate work at Penn that I think I've carried through into the people work and into the fiber work and sought out and found in spades in these worlds is the idea of community. The idea of not just learning all the things you possibly can about these fields and sponging in information and actually then turning it back around and making it into knowledge or insight or data and publishing or teaching or lecturing or having a seminar or discussion, but really gathering like-minded, like-hearted people who are also interested in this and saying, what do you have to teach me? What do you have to teach me? Can I not show up to the stage and say, here's my 40-minute lecture, but can I give a 20-minute lecture and then we can have 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A? Because I think it really comes alive for me, not just by reading about it, although that's obviously a place that I will go. I will, devour all the information, but how it becomes knowledge, insight, intelligence, wisdom, lore is by sharing it with other people. And, the old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, has not felt truer to me than in the quilting and crocheting world, where people are so generous with their time, with their materials, with their unsolicited advice about your latest project, with their show and tell, with their Instagram accounts, with their free patterns. I needed to borrow a needle from someone because I was working on a deadline. I called a woman who lives down the block from me and I said, can I just come over and grab a needle because I don't even have time to go to the store? She gave me 2 boxes of needles and said, don't worry about it. Just take what you need. Just go, make, create, be. And you might be sitting alone at a sewing machine, or you might be sitting alone in a rare book library doing your research, or you might be sitting alone behind a computer writing a policy. But there's a person on the other side of what you're making, whether that's the spreadsheet or the policy or the quilt, right? And that's the kind of the bonding that I've always found so rewarding, that it's not just me in a silo. It really has to be me out in the world. And these things feed into each other, right? Like, can I have a quilted or a patchwork life where I have a job that pays for my fabric addiction, right? And can I actually take my rare books into the office for a lunch and learn, even though none of these people have a rare book background, but they're excited to learn about what I do outside of work, right? And so it's this, the weaving, I guess I'll say it again, the weaving together of people who really care about this and the bringing of knowledge to people who might not know about it, and the joy, just again the joy and the positivity and the rewardingness of discovery and learning.
I love this. The patchwork life. I think that could have been the other title for Ampersand. What advice do you have for people who are pursuing or thinking of pursuing an Ampersand life?
Oh gosh, this is a painful one, but I wanted to bring it up because it feels so present right now and so important, that I've had periods of burnout where I've tried to straddle what I call two motorcycles at once, right? Like you have one leg on one and one leg on the other, and they're going at different speeds, and you're trying to, have a day job by day and vest your equity. And then at night, you want to go like to your quilting meeting, or you want to, go give a talk at a rare book conference. And it has been a struggle for me at times to try to do it all or juggle it all. And remember that I have 24 hours in the day, unfortunately, just like everyone else, not 72 just because I have three passions at the same time. And sometimes that has meant having to put something down for a period of time or deprioritize and remember the awful reality, which I think is particularly poignant for women, of you can have it all, just not at the same time. And I hate to think about, oh, am I leaving this behind forever? Because the ambition of the ampersand, I think, is to be able to do it all. And yet, I think life has seasons, and there might be weeks when I don't turn on the sewing machine, but there might also be evenings where I say, do not disturb me. I'm putting on my out of office hat, and I'm just going to quilt into the wee hours, and it's going to cost me tomorrow, but I really want to do it today. But I think there's just this recognition of the realities of life, and to just know that these things, if you come with an abundance mindset and you don't think of it as either or closed doors, open doors, that these things can never be taken away from you. Guess what? I got a green card from the US government for my work in rare books. And some days I'm sheepish because I don't actually do that day in and day out anymore. But it's still part of me. And that's, I think, the message is that you will continue to be a palimpsest, which is a rare book term for something that gets written on over and over again, that your life is going to have layers and layers of meaning as an ampersand, and that you can sort of treat them as additive and try to find the connections among them and the intersections of them versus I have to do this or that. It can truly be an and. It just might not all happen in the same day.
I'm hearing that, also this idea of ampersand, it can never be taken away from you, kind of like a book. Once it's been written on, it's there. We're not erasing things.
It is there.
What else would you like to add to the Ampersand Manifesto?
I take great pride in the rediscovery of my creativity. As a child, I was a singer. I was always drawing or painting. I learned how to do calligraphy at 11, but then I sort of put it away, right? These are things that one in the capitalist world does as a hobby, or on the side, or when one has time, or this isn't really worth the investment of money, or things like that. But I realized how much joy it gave me and how much fulfillment, and actually how much better I was at my work when I took those 10 minutes to go look at a book at Letterform Archive instead of just diving back into my email inbox. And then while working at Springboard, when my whole day was emails and phone calls and meetings, the joy of putting away my computer and pulling out the sewing machine and using a completely different part of my brain, working with my hands, meditating into the fabric. Again, I don't mean to sound romantic, but jiggering that muscle back out of its stupor, because we all suffer from what my yoga instructors call text asana. Like we have these hunched over backs and we're constantly thumbing things out into the world and, hustling from phone call to phone call. The creative gene lives in everyone. I think it just goes to sleep. The resurrection of the validity of my creative work from the graveyard of, oh, this is just a hobby, this is just a craft, this is not monetizable. Who cares? I'm doing it for its own sake, and it makes me a better person and a better worker. So that's what I would like to add to the Ampersand manifesto, is find that creativity because it's there, and believe in its worth, even if it doesn't have a dollar value attached to it.
Sim, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much. Folks, you can learn more about Sim's work at bento.me/stadani, or you can follow her on Instagram at sim1303. If you liked this show, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends and fellow ampersands. And if you're enjoying our show, please leave a 3-sentence review on Apple Podcasts. That's right, just 3 sentences, and you'll be able to help more people find out about the show. I had a chance to listen back on my interview with Sim, and there were so many nuggets of wisdom. I'm going to try my best to distill down to 3. 1. This idea of delight came through in different areas of Sim's life. Whether it was discovering a rare book, realizing that People Ops work felt fulfilling, or finding the perfect fabric. I was kind of surprised when I looked up the definition of the word delight. It simply means pleasing greatly. I realized that my own use of this word is imbued with an element of surprise or newness, like how people in the Letterform archive would exclaim, "Wow." I love thinking about how delight is versatile. It can show up just as easily in a library, as a tech office, as an art studio. 2. Community and connection were also themes that came up again and again. Participation in the arts, whether visual, performing, or domestic crafts, isn't just about producing the art itself. A critical piece is connecting with others. And for fabric crafts, it's often a one-to-one gift. I remember when my own baby was born, we received these beautiful handmade blankets, crocheted and knitted with love. And I've held on to these items fiercely, even though the small human they were intended for has long outgrown them. 3. Throughout these interviews, we've explored the topic of how different people design or organize their ampersand life. And oftentimes, this is not some grand plan that they had in advance, but what made sense in whatever season of life they were in. We've heard stories about people who roughly split their time between day jobs and nights and weekends gigs, and others who spent about a decade doing one thing and another decade developing another thing. I love what Sim said about, "It's still part of me." All too often, we discard parts of us simply because they might be dormant in the moment, but we can always nurture them and bring them back because they live inside us.
I'm not going to pretend that I have anything like a PhD in people, but I think that work is best done learning on the job and recognizing that no 2 people are the same, just as no 2 books are the same, but all books are alike and no 2 people are alike.